Hello, welcome to the screencast for What is Philosophy by Monroe C. Beardsley and Elizabeth Lane Beardsley. But before we get into their article, I do want to give you a little bit more of an introduction about philosophy itself. So on the syllabus, I mentioned that philosophy likes to look at life's big questions, the things we ask ourselves about meaning, the world, our place in it. But what about our everyday beliefs? So the abstract sort of things that play into our personal lives, and what sort of choices we should make, like how we should structure our lives. Do we want to be fitness fanatics or foodies or cinephiles, movies? Want to get up early, get up late, all that stuff. Want to be social or more of a loner? What does it mean to be a good person? Where does the concept come from? And how do I decide? You might want to think about if you want a family of your own. How should I treat them? How should I treat the family I already have? What role does family have in life in general? What kind of job should I choose? Should I be involved in politics? Should I pay attention to the news? All this stuff mixes around and comes up with, what does it mean to have a good life? Is it individually different for everybody, or are there some commonalities for all people? So these are still kind of big questions, but they're more about our everyday lives. Also, what about our factual beliefs? So the difference between a factual and a non-factual belief might be the difference between what I talked about before, the empirical world and the abstract conceptual world in our minds. So factual beliefs are about what we can actually measure and observe. How do we know they're true or false? So can we tell the difference between science and pseudoscience? What about the difference between conspiracy theories, the possibly biased mass media? How do we get to the truth? Whatever counts as the truth. Got to figure out what that is in the first place. What does it mean to understand something in the world, a system or an object? No matter how big or how small. And when I say small, I don't mean unimportant. I mean that you need less evidence to be convinced of the conclusion or the truth. So if a kid is asking you about the different colors, and they ask you what red is, all you have to do is point to a stop sign. That's enough evidence to say this is red. So that's pretty small. But something big, like what does it mean for our country or our world to be just? And that's going to have a lot of evidence before any person, any reasonable person, is convinced. So philosophy, while it worries about big questions that are concerns of everybody, like what happens when we die, or what is good and bad, also concerned with our beliefs about how we should live our lives, so our personal beliefs, and it's also concerned with factual beliefs. So we're wondering where we come up with them at all, ever, and what they are. How can we know if we're correct in holding the ones that we do? So two more things before we start the article. I want to tell you about the field of philosophy itself, the different branches, and a very quick, very general idea of its history. So in my little table here, you can see that 5 of them are in bold. These are the major subfields, and the ones that aren't in bold fall underneath those ones that are the major subfields. So the 5 are epistemology, metaphysics, logic, aesthetics, and moral theory. Sometimes you might even want to wrap aesthetics up into epistemology, but not everybody does. So epistemology is just a fancy word for the study of knowledge. Episteme is the ancient Greek word for knowledge. So ology, study of knowledge. What is it? How do we get it? What counts as it instead of opinion? Metaphysics. Meta just means after the physics. And it's a quirk of history that it was named this. A couple centuries after a famous philosopher, Aristotle, wrote all his books, another scholar was organizing them to publish them for other people. And he just happened to put this book after the physics, so it came to be known later as the field of metaphysics. And what metaphysics deals with is how we structure the world. What are the conceptual ways we structure the world, or how the world itself actually is structured. If physics deals with empirical interrelations of matter, metaphysics is more about questions like what exists, what doesn't exist, what depends on what else to be true. And if it's confusing, that's fine. It's not the easiest thing to get your head around, but we'll talk about it more as the semester goes on. Logic is about how statements and beliefs relate to one another. Why do we think certain things provide evidence for certain other things? So you can study logic formally or informally. If you have looked at computer science at all, you have run into some kinds of formal logic. If-then statements are logical. When things are conjoined, we have the and in between them, or the or. So that's all about how beliefs or sentences or propositions or bits of data relate to one another. Aesthetics is about beauty and art. Why do we have those concepts? What are they? And moral theory is about what is right and wrong, why we think things are right and wrong, the way that we think the world ought to be. That's a key phrase, ought to be. That's a value judgment. So all these other subfields, we will actually look at one or two articles from almost all of them. And hopefully by the end of the semester, you'll be able to see how they fit into the larger categories and sometimes interact with each other. So the history of Western philosophy is often divided into periods, and a caveat before this, there's lots of other kinds of philosophy in the world. Eastern philosophy, African philosophy. But we are steeped in the Western philosophical tradition because, one, it's where we live, and two, it has had a massive influence on the intellectual development of the world. And just because we're studying Western philosophy doesn't mean other forms of philosophy are unworthy of being studied, but you got to start somewhere. So these categories are not fixed, and they're very approximate, but if you want to get a sense of how a concept developed over time, sometimes it's good to have this kind of benchmark in your head that you can think back on. So ancient Western philosophy began around 7th century BCE. So that means before Common Era. We normally call that before Christ, but this is a more universal way that scholars refer to the time periods in our history. So BCE is before Common Era, CE is Common Era. 7th century BCE to 5th century CE, or after death, in something you might be more familiar with. And this dawn of Western philosophy, a lot of people know the names Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, and they're considered the fathers of Western philosophy. Around the fall of Rome, when Christianity started to take over the political power and structure of the Western world, philosophy also starts to shift. It's mostly done by religious scholars, monks, and they do a lot of what we call today apologetics, which is melding Christianity with reason and science. They also did a lot of logic. Then we come up to the Enlightenment period, or the scientific and industrial revolutions, when everybody started to specialize. Philosophy and the natural sciences, like chemistry and physics and biology, were part of philosophy up until this time, and then they started to diverge and become their own field or discipline. So right around that time, philosophy also changed to be less dependent on religious scholars and religious texts as well. That went all the way up to what we call the contemporary period, the 20th and 21st centuries. Still too close to it to maybe differentiate how it overall differs from everything else. But contemporary is often further split into analytic and continental. We're going to do mostly analytic in this class, And all it refers to is that there are two different traditions and methodologies of doing philosophy in the Western world. So in the United States and in England, Scotland, and Ireland, generally are associated with the analytic tradition, while continental refers to continental Europe. It's the rest of Europe. And there's a lot of interchange and interaction between the two, and some people don't even think it's a real distinction. But it's good to at least know about the split or the terminology. So analytic is more focused on logical analysis, while continental philosophy is more like literary theory. This, I just wanted to give you a sense of how complicated the history of Western philosophy is, but I don't want to overwhelm you. If you take this, it can be very, very overwhelming. There's a lot. If you take it bit by bit, piece by piece, you'll hopefully build up a picture of some of the most important concepts. Now we're going to finally start with the article itself. In our textbook, this starts on page 3. And in the introductory section of the article, they meaning the Beardsleys, want us to think about how we currently got the beliefs we have today about everything. And we all have millions or even billions of beliefs. Some of them are unconscious, and we would never even think of them as beliefs. Like the fact that if we wanted to leave the room, we could open the door and fit through it. But if you actually sat down and thought about it, you would say, yeah, I believe that. Or that gravity will hold, and that everything you drop will fall towards the center of the earth. Or that the sun will rise. All these little miniature beliefs add up to be our entire system of belief. And when we're born, we presumably don't have too many or any at all. And we absorb things from the outside world, from our parents, from our teachers, from the church, our peers, mass media. Where do our own decisions come into play? How many of the beliefs that we have were just unconsciously absorbed and accepted versus how many of the beliefs that we have did we sit down and really think about what we thought was most reasonable or most true? So you might think growing up, your parents give you some of your beliefs in the world. Why is the sky blue? They tell you about Santa Claus. So there he is in the bottom right corner here. And I didn't exactly format it too well, but you get the picture. And the Beardsleys use Santa Claus as an example of when we might start questioning our beliefs. So you might go to the mall and see a Santa posing for pictures. And you're like, well, is that the real Santa? What about all the other malls in the area or in the world? Is the real Santa there as well? You might ask your parents, and they might tell you something like, well, they're Santa's helpers. And as you progress, you'll question this belief more and more until you might get to the point where you change your belief in Santa Claus. So you're looking at your reasons for believing something when in that specific instance. You're questioning. So this is where, on the bottom of page 4, the Beardsleys start the section Philosophical Questions. What makes a philosophical question different to an ordinary question? And the Beardsleys like their examples. Sometimes they use a detailed example before they give their definition, and that's what they do in this case. So they ask you to imagine that you're sitting with a friend, and they mention a legal case to you. Doesn't matter what it is. It could be a demonstration for Black Lives Matter. It could be an industrialist who has dumped waste. It could be someone who's robbed a bank. It could be embezzlement. But for our purposes, let's say this person is definitely guilty. They've been convicted. And the friend says, well, they deserve to go to jail. And you might agree instinctively. Of course, they're guilty. They deserve to go to jail. But when you want to start thinking philosophically, you sort of start thinking sometimes like a toddler, a little kid. Why do they deserve to go to jail? We just sort of feel like it's the right thing to do. But if you press on it a little bit, you realize that these laws and rules and buildings and institutions have been around since before you were born, and no one's ever really proven to you why the government should have the power to curtail the freedom of anybody, or why, if somebody does something wrong, our only recourse is to lock them up. Aren't there other options? Have we ever even sat down and thought about it? So when we're asking these kinds of questions, we're asking a philosophical question. What does it mean to be responsible for something in the first place? If somebody had a mental illness, maybe they have diminished capacity. If you don't have your full ability to choose, shouldn't that affect whether or not we lock someone up? Okay, so the point is that philosophical questions, as opposed to regular questions, are general and fundamental. So first we started out with this one person who broke the law and is guilty. And we say, yeah, okay, that person should go to jail. That's a specific and non-fundamental instance. When we started philosophical questioning, we moved to more general cases. How should we treat all people? What's fair for everyone? And what does it mean for something to count as a particular instance? So in other words, philosophical questions are about entire classes of things, not individual things. So never any individual court case, but instead, why should the court system have the authority to organize how we live? Philosophical questions are fundamental. So fundamental here means that if something depends on something else to exist, the thing it depends on is more fundamental. So for example, our bodies are dependent upon molecules and atoms to exist. So atoms and molecules are more fundamental than our bodies. Because if they didn't exist, we couldn't exist. It doesn't only have to be material objects, though. It can be concepts as well. So you need addition to exist before calculus can exist. So addition is more fundamental. And that's the concepts, not anything else. So if one belief supports another belief or lends evidence to it, that thing that lends evidence is more fundamental. Page 7, since now we know what types of questions count as philosophical, we're going to use those questions to do some philosophical examination. So they tell us the definition right at the outset here. Anything that concerns the truth of a philosophical belief. So a philosophical belief, general and fundamental. And then we wonder if it's true. We can explore the belief by assuming that it's true and investigating how it ties into all our other philosophical beliefs. Or we can examine the belief itself by questioning its truth and trying to see if it's based on good justification, which means just good reasons and good reasoning. So we get another example from the Beardsleys. Just pick a random belief that somebody might hold. Culture X flourished in Central Africa hundreds of years before Christianity. Why would anybody hold this particular belief? And say, a historian told you this belief. And now in our everyday world, we say, well, the historian's an expert in this field, so I'll accept it. But if you're examining a belief in a philosophical way, you would question the historian. How did you figure out that this culture flourished at this time and place? And they tell you that there was no writing, so we couldn't read their documents. All the cloth and the thatched roof houses, they've all decayed, so we don't know it that way. But what we do know is we had some shards of pottery, and we tested them using thermoluminescence. So you aim a beam of light, and there are certain atoms, uranium, where they decay at a very steady rate. And we tested how much uranium is in there, so we know that this piece of pottery was used by a culture in this spot at this time. And again, it'd be very reasonable to just say, okay, I trust you and your authority. But if we're still examining the belief philosophically, we might move to the physicist and then say, well, okay, just because uranium decays in this manner now, how do we know that it decayed in the same exact way hundreds or thousands of years ago? What if the rules of nature, the laws of nature and physics have changed? And now we're getting into the territory of philosophy, because this is metaphysics. If you didn't understand it before, if we're asking about the nature of the scientific laws itself, the nature of causation, just because A causes B right now doesn't mean it always will or always did. We're thinking about the structure of the world itself. And you can't figure it out by observing what happened thousands of years ago. You might have to figure it out using reasoning. So we're getting into philosophical territory, specifically metaphysics. We've gotten more general and fundamental by examining our commonplace belief philosophically. So for two more examples, they do two dialogues on page 9. I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm not going to read them out for you. The first one is about how you ought to have written to your parents last weekend because you promised to. So the two people in the dialogue debate. Well, what does it mean to promise? Why should you always hold promises? What if something important comes up? What is the nature of a promise? So it starts with a specific belief, non-fundamental. Person A should have written to their parents, and goes all the way down to the nature of what promises are and why we should keep them. The second one is about the definition of democracy. And a lot of times people get into these semantic arguments where, well, I meant a different thing than you did. So what does it mean to define a word? How do we get to a general place where we figure out how we can interact using word meanings? Now we have three examples. We have the Central African culture from thousands of years ago. We have what it means to make a promise, and we have what it means to have a definition of a word, and we've confused ourselves a lot. What is the import? Why should we be doing this kind of philosophical examination anyway? And the Beardsleys say on their final couple of pages, 10, 11, and 12, that it helps us with three core intellectual values. Why should we have intellectual values? Well, because all of us want to get as close to the truth as we can, because it makes it easier to live life. So these three intellectual values: clarity, reasonableness, and consistency. When we're clear on definitions, it's easier to get to the closer to the truth, to a better supported belief. Reasonableness means that we have good evidence or a good chain of evidence that supports our beliefs. And consistency means that one of our beliefs doesn't completely contradict another. So when we do philosophical examination, we're aiming for clarity, reasonableness, and consistency. And at the very end of the article, they say, well, what about action? It's all well and good to have clear and reasonable and consistent beliefs, but how's that going to make us do anything? If you really want to be a good person, you have to act. And they respond by saying that, of course, you can only act out of your beliefs. So if you have a less true belief, you're going to act in a less good way to match the circumstances of the outside world. Whereas if you have a belief that's more well supported, your actions are going to match the context of the world, the environment, in a much better way. So thought and action and emotion are all tied up together. And if one of them is really screwed up, it's only ever going to hurt you in the other areas.